In the 1700s, the richest colonies in America were in the Caribbean, and the richest of these rich Caribbean colonies was Saint-Domingue. The colony of Saint-Domingue consisted of 8,000 plantations, and by the late 1700s, these plantations produced 40% of the world's sugar supply and half of the world's coffee supply. The population of Saint-Domingue consisted of a half-million slaves, 40,000 whites, and 30,000 gens de couleur libre, or free people of color. The whites were divided between plantation owners, Grands Blancs, merchants, lawyers, and Petits Blancs, or poorer whites. Saint-Domingue was a place of extreme inequality, and the example of the French Revolution really inspired violent uprisings throughout the colony for more than a decade. So Saint-Domingue was a colony of France, so it was connected to the revolution in this way. The different groups in Saint-Domingue interpreted the French Revolution in different ways. For the Grands Blancs, the rich landowners, they thought revolution would actually be good for them because it would give them more autonomy, fewer economic restrictions on trade, but for them, they resented the demands of Petits Blancs, the poorer whites, who sought equality of citizenship, but that is equality of citizenship for all white people. Both white groups opposed the insistence of les gens de couleur libre that the rights of man meant equal treatment for all people regardless of race. So those ideas in the Declaration of Independence and in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, they only extended to white people. In 1791, rumors started spreading around the colony that King Louis XVI of France had declared an end to slavery. This sparked a slave revolt that had been brewing for some time. Slaves burned 1,000 plantations and killed hundreds of white and mixed-race people, basically the people who were oppressing them. And it was chaos. Slaves, whites, and free people of color all fought against each other. Both the Spanish and the British tried to come in and seize control of the colony, knowing full well that France was in a state of revolution and couldn't do anything to defend the colony, and this just added to the chaos. Eventually, power was seized by slaves led by Toussaint Louverture, who is himself a former slave. So, when the dust settles in the early 1800s, it becomes clear that something really unheard of in world history had taken place, and that slaves had successfully conducted their own revolution. So, for the first time in world history, the last in a society, the last in a social hierarchy, had become the first. People at the bottom of the hierarchy were now at the top. The slaves were free, fully independent citizens, and this was really the only completely successful slave revolt in human history. The name Saint-Domingue, that was a French colonial name, that was eliminated, and the former slaves renamed their country Haiti. And this word was taken from the indigenous language. The indigenous people on the island were deceased, but for the slaves who were African in origin, adopting a name from the indigenous language was meant to be a symbolic break with Europe. So they were exploited on this island, and they saw themselves as being connected to the indigenous people that had lived on the island and were also exploited by the Europeans before them. So Haiti became the second independent state in the Americas. Saint-Domingue was a rich colony that produced a lot of wealth, but the plantation economy was destroyed during the Revolution. Whites fled, the land was redistributed among former slaves and free blacks, and Haiti became a nation of small-scale farmers producing for their own needs. The destructiveness of the Haitian Revolution, divisions of race, divisions of color, divisions of class, and continued opposition from outside forces meant that the country pretty much stayed in a state of constant poverty. But in the early 1800s, it was a source of extreme hope, but also great fear. Hope for oppressed people looking for freedom, and fear of oppressors hoping to continue to benefit by exploiting other people. Slavery all but disappeared from the Atlantic world between the years 1780 and 1890. Slavery was ancient. It was practiced from the times of the earliest civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, but in the context of the Atlantic revolutions, it really couldn't be viewed as legitimate any longer. No matter how anybody tried to spin it, slavery was wrong, and people were really coming around to that fact. When you look at the language of the American Declaration of Independence or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, it's pretty clear that these documents are not compatible with human slavery. From the Enlightenment perspective, slavery was a violation of natural rights. From the religious perspective, slavery was an affront to God. From an economic perspective, it was becoming clear that slavery wasn't really needed for economic progress, and that it may actually slow economic progress. England and the American colony of New England were some of the most prosperous regions in the Western world, and both were free of slave labor. Slavery began to really be seen as an outdated economic system, one that was far inferior to capitalism, which was creating wealth for these industrial countries, while at the same time viewed as being more virtuous, more practical than slavery. Capitalist system, of course, brought its own problems that we'll talk about next week on our podcast on the Industrial Revolution. To some extent, it was the actions of slaves that helped end slavery. The Haitian Revolution was the first successful slave revolt, but this was followed by major slave rebellions in the West Indies. They may not have been as successful as the Haitian Revolution. They did show the world that slaves were not going to put up with slavery for much longer. And public opinion was evolving and turning against slavery. Britain put down slave revolts in their colonies in the Caribbean, and the British people, the general public, was typically appalled by the reports of violence. So public opinion in Britain started to turn. So there are just so many things wrong with slavery. It was morally wrong from the Enlightenment perspective. It went against the Bible, so it was wrong from a religious standpoint. It was from specifically the Christianity standpoint. Capitalism was producing more wealth, and it was becoming hard to maintain due to rebellions that were springing up. So all these factors kind of came together to create what is known as the Abolitionist Movement. So think abolish slavery. The term abolitionist has very specific historic connotations to the abolition of slavery. In Great Britain, pamphlets were spread that described the horrors of slavery. They were followed with public petitions in Britain, boycotts of slave sugar. Public meetings were held where former slaves were invited to speak and share their experiences with slavery. So, because of all this public pressure in Britain, in 1807, Britain became the first country to forbid the sale of slaves within the British Empire, and in 1834, Great Britain freed all the slaves in the British Empire. And really within the next half century, other nations followed Britain's lead. Britain naval vessels would patrol the Atlantic, searching for slave ships, which from their perspective were illegal, and they would free the human cargoes. Many of the freed slaves were taken to a colony in West Africa known as Freetown, which today is in Sierra Leone. Following political independence in Latin America, the Latin American countries abolished slavery by the 1850s. Brazil was the last to do so in 1888, really bringing 4 centuries of Atlantic slavery to an end. But the abolition of slavery didn't happen without a fight. Slave economies did well into the 1800s, and really it was plantation owners who were fighting the abolitionist movement, and it was slave traders who were fighting the movement. And this is both European slave traders and African slave traders. So even after the slave trade had been declared illegal, they continued to ship millions of captives. Most of them ended up in Brazil and Cuba. In the southern United States, resistance to the abolitionist movement eventually led to a highly destructive civil war between the years 1861 and 1865. One thing to note is that Europeans in the late 1800s would come to Africa and impose colonial rule on Africa. And one of the justifications they gave was that Africa still had slavery and this was wrong and they needed to emancipate African slaves. So Europe had participated in the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, for more than 4 centuries. They were really the reason why the slave trade was so big. So that Europeans would impose colonial rule on Africa on the pretense of ending slavery that they played a major part in, is really one of the great ironies of the whole abolitionist process.